Should everyone do a gut microbiome test?
Only if they have someone who is an expert that can interpret the results.
Okay. Is there any general benefit to taking a probiotic supplement every day?
No.
Interesting. Do my gut microbes determine how easily I can lose weight?
Yes.
Can my microbes stress me out?
Oh, yes.
Okay. And if I look after my gut, will it help me live longer?
100% yes.
Okay, great. Wow, there's some really interesting things here that we should unpack. So, look, our first conversation went down really well with the community, focused largely around your book, and you've got this incredible analogy of climate change and how that mirrors what's going on in our gut ecosystem. And I think on reflection, I really want to make today's episode super practical for folks.
Okay.
We had tons of questions, and I want you to almost teach us how to be activists for our own microbial ecosystem, our own microbes. So, you know, we're waving the flag with a Just Stop Oil for our microbes in today's episode. And I think what would be great is, you know, if we were to do the best thing possible in a day for our microbes, our gut health, what does that look like? What does it look like? You know, it's almost like taking your kids to Disneyland and giving them all the treats that they want. What is the equivalent for our microbes from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep at night?
Well, the first thing has to be don't go to Disneyland. I literally couldn't have anything worse for your microbiome than going to ultra-processed food land in the land of the morbidly obese. So don't go there.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing I'd say is if we've learned one thing from microbiome science, it's that our microbiomes are really individualized. And the major challenge in answering that question is that it will probably vary from individual to individual. And it will probably vary from city to city and country to country. And we know that exists. But I think there are some sort of common generalizable things that we can say. And we're going to make a broad assumption in the answer to this question, which is that diversity is I think a measure that we can all largely agree on is a measure of health of any ecosystem.
Okay.
And a human microbial ecosystem is no different in that regard. So
Okay.
what we're aiming for in our daily lives is to maintain diversity. And we're also aiming to achieve, I think, two other key features. Through diversity, we want resilience, which means that when we hit the bumps in the road that we just all inevitably hit because we, you know, live in Western cities, if you're listening to this probably, and we've got busy lives, that actually our gut has just got the ability to cope with that. It can deal with the occasional hit of antibiotics. It can deal with the occasional kind of trauma, but also it's got the plasticity to adapt to it. So I think of the health of a microbiome having those three key things. It's diverse, it's resilient, and it's got that plasticity that it needs to adapt. So whatever we do has got to give it those things.
That's great. So that was actually probably where I should have started at this in defining exactly what we mean by good gut health, or doing things that are good for our gut health. So diversity, resilience, plasticity. So keeping in mind all the time that everyone's what's good for someone is different to another person.
Yeah.
But there are some general sort of practices within that.
Yeah. And I think, you know, probably I mentioned this last time, when I think about the microbiome, I think about it having these sort of two other kind of important constructs. It's not just the makeup of microbes, it's the fact that it's got some evolutionary basis, so that whatever we're doing is supporting and nourishing those evolutionary relationships that we have, but also that it's got that time-dependent relationship with us. So the answer to that question is very different if you're, you know, a neonate or a baby, or if you're an older person, you know, towards the end of life. Those demands are going to be very, very different. They're going to be different from men and women. They're going to be different for people living in a rural community to living in an urban environment.
Gotcha.
And so we just got to have that flexibility in mind.
Okay, great. With that in mind, let's look at what a healthy day looks like
for a 39-year-old man. Let's say.
Asking for a friend.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Yeah. Okay.
For someone, let's say, you know, who has a working week, commutes, is relatively healthy and is able-bodied, so they can put into practice a lot of these things.
So the good news in answering this question is that the answer is probably full of common sense things that you already know and already tell your listeners and already practice yourself. And the gift of the microbiome is that it explains why those things are really beneficial to do, and why and how they work.
Okay.
Right. So what we're going to do in our day is we're going to follow some basic principles, which mean first, do no harm to these microbial systems. Right. So the first thing that we're going to try to do is not to damage them. And the second thing that we're going to try and do is we're going to try and nurture the ones that we need, and then we're going to try and feed and sustain those microbes that give us the balance that we need. And to achieve those things is we're going to look beyond food and nutrition. So food and nutrition is super, super important, obviously important, we're going to talk a lot about that, I guess, but we're going to think beyond that. And what I want you to think about when you're trying to do these things is I want you to consider your gut much like a garden. It's a living thing. And if you treat living things badly, they'll die and they will treat you badly. And if you treat living things well and sustainably, then they will treat you well. So we've got a living ecosystem, and we're trying to nurture and protect that living ecosystem. So of a day, what that means is we're gonna hopefully, it's not always the same for me, I'm gonna wake from a restful night's sleep.
Okay.
So we're gonna acknowledge that the gut...
This is hurdle number one.
Hurdle number one, right? If you've got young kids, let's say, it's not always possible, right? And we sleep badly in this country. We sleep badly in West, and there's plenty of real experts on sleep. I don't pretend to be a sleep expert, but what I do know is that the microbes in our gut oscillate with our circadian rhythms, and they help define our circadian rhythms. And there's that two-way conversation between the brain and the gut around sleep. And if you're not sleeping properly, you're not going to have a happy immune system. You're not going to have a happy set of microbes. So in this fictional fantasy world, I'm going to wake from a really good night's sleep. And the first thing that I'm going to do is ignore my telephone, and I'm going to ignore all that digital content, which is going to wake up that gut-brain interaction and put it on the wrong footing from right?
So when I'm waking up, as a lot of people do, and I used to, you have your phone or your iPad or some sort of device that's going to give you news or notifications straight away. This is not good for our microbes.
Well, it's just not good for our health, full stop, right?
Yeah.
And again, it's like a brilliant example of what I was telling you about before. There's a million reasons why you shouldn't be doing that. And it's not good for your gut brain, and it's not good for your immune system, and it's not good for your mental health more broadly. But actually I've had to take, I'm really bad at this. Like, I've got to be totally honest with you. Like, I find these things hard to do myself. Sure. So I don't know if I can promote products. I have no value in it. There's this quite a good startup called Brick, run by these kids out of Stanford.
I've heard about Brick, yes.
I've just started using that because if I don't take my phone away from me and I don't have a physical disconnect from it, I'm just on it.
Do you want to describe to folks what Brick is?
So Brick is like, it's an app. You can find it, go online. It's a small startup. I mean, hopefully it won't fold now that I've given it some hype. But it's so what it relies is you tapping your phone onto through to their hardware, and there's a sort of Bluetooth functionality, and it just blocks all your social media apps or any apps on your phone that you don't want to have access to. So for me, it's email. So anyway, I have to digitally detoxify myself, and I've had to be really proactive in how I do that, because if I don't do that, I can't sleep, and if I can't sleep, I can't function.
Honestly, the popularity of apps similar and hardware similar to Brick are rocketing, because I think a lot more people are coming around to this idea that even if they didn't understand the connection with their microbes, they definitely recognize the impact on their mental well-being, how excitatory it can be, particularly use of these devices at night and the disruption to our sleep, even just the simple things of comparison and anxiety and all that kind of stuff that's mixed into the apps that we use and are addicted to every single.
So true story. In preparation for this podcast, last night I was not doing what I've just told you, because I was lying in bed thinking, oh gosh, I've got to meet Rupi tomorrow. I better say something intelligent. So I was doom scrolling. And there's a point that I'm about to tell you, because the second thing I'm going to tell you in my list of what we're going to do in the day to protect our microbiome is we're going to wake up and we're not going to take a bunch of supplements. Okay. We're not going to do that, right? Okay. So last night I was just wonder how crazy people really are about this. So I was on a subreddit. If you want a bit of entertainment, go to the Reddit subreddit on supplements. Okay. And I went down a kind of proper supplement hole.
Wow.
And the madness of it it's just so my point is that another reason to do that is because there's just so much misinformation. There's so much there's so many people giving you the wrong advice, and it's so easy to be sucked into that world. And the best and easiest time to be sucked into a subreddit on supplements is at 1 a.m. when you should be sleeping. And there was this woman, proudly saying, I've taken 64 supplements a day for 53 days. And I'm just thinking,
wow. Yeah.
Where do you start with that? Point? Right? Yeah. Your problem is something quite different, and we'll talk about that maybe in a bit. So digitally detoxify and sleep, and then wake up in the morning, and the first thing you should not be reaching for is a bunch of supplements.
Before we get into that, I just want to there is this interesting concept that probably was promoted on Reddit, actually, to be fair. But this idea of a kale and cocaine phone, have you heard of this?
No.
So it takes the sort of concept of brick a little bit further. Yeah. So brick kind of locks those addictive apps, and then you've only got your message app, your phone, and maybe Google Maps, and that's it, the boring stuff. Having 2 physical phones, one where you've got all the addictive apps, TikTok, Instagram, WhatsApp, all that kind of stuff. You've got that. That's the one that you use, for maybe an hour or 2 a day, and you keep it locked in the drawer. And then you've got your kale phone. Your kale phone is the boring phone. You take that to work, and your family can contact you in emergencies.
So what you're promoting is a burner phone.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that doesn't seem so sustainable to me. It seems like perhaps we're not really addressing the underlying problem.
Which is to have a more sort of holistic relationship with these apps in the first place. With
information and technology. And that brings in like broader, I suppose, discussions that are pretty timely right now.
For extreme problems, sometimes you do need the extreme solution in the interim. Right. So if anyone there is struggling, the kale and cocaine phone is a viable option.
Good.
But
well, we'll recommend that. Yeah.
So sorry, we're going to talk about supplements.
So I'm going to wake up in the morning rested. I'm not going to go to my phone, and I'm going to go downstairs, and I'm going to connect with some people in my house. That'll be my family. I appreciate that's not easy to do necessarily if you live alone, and it's not easy for everybody. But the point I'm making is that social connection is a profound importance in the health of our microbial ecosystems. And of course, your home and the microbes you come into contact with in your home are also very, very important. And so, I'm going to think about that a little bit. I'm going to go and say hi to my kids, and I'm going to connect with them. And I'm going to go and kiss my wife if she'll let me. She may not. And
well, you talked about in the book, didn't you, about how just the act of kissing is microbial transfer.
I'm not going to snog my wife.
Sure.
She is. I tell you right now, she's not having it. But what I think the point that I'm making is that physical connection. So I think there's this fact that it came out of some work that when you kiss, you transfer like 80 million microbes per kiss.
Yeah.
But it's got to be a good snog. But the kind of broader point is that physical connectivity and real world networks promote microbial health.
Okay.
Just to divert for just 2 seconds, there was quite an interesting study that came out of some work done in Honduras, and they were looking at 18 sort of discrete socially disconnected villages, and how social networks work within those villages, and how that works for the sharing of microbes. Within those villages, what they found is that people at the center of their societies had much more diverse microbial ecosystems. But those orders of connection extended beyond your immediate family into second order kind of social connections. And actually those things existed over time. So social connectivity and real world connectivity is very, very important. So when in this fictional day, I'm not entirely sure it exists in my life, but I'm having breakfast with my family at a table.
Brilliant.
And we're taking some time out, and we're going to have a little conversation about the day. My 14-year-old daughter's probably going to moan and, well, sorry, Libs. She's going to be charming and be super excited about her day, and I'm sure really interact with me. But we're going to try and take some time to do that.
I love that. I mean, perhaps you can't do this every single day, but I think, even if it's just through the lens of your microbial health, perhaps it's something you can do on a weekend, a Saturday or Sunday. I mean, I love the idea of one day when my son is older, and he is charming as well.
Of course he is.
And
like his father.
He'll want to spend a few hours or an hour in the morning, like having breakfast and having connection and hugging and eating some delicious food that he would have cooked as well.
But also, like, with your friends, like that's what came out of the Honduras study. Like, I think, one of the greatest problems that we face in a modern urbanized society is loneliness. Like loneliness is it's a catastrophe, and it creates harm through multiple different multifactorial ways. And as men, we're also not particularly, in midlife, we're less good at kind of building those relationships. They're really profoundly important, and we need to work at them. And again, there's a million reasons why that's good for your health. That probably have nothing to do with your microbiome, frankly, but it is also good for your microbiome.
Brilliant. Have we brushed our teeth yet?
I probably haven't. I would brush my teeth after breakfast in my day.
Is there a reason? Is there a reason why, like for the health of our oral microbiome or gut microbiome?
Yes. So oral health is extremely important, and it's extremely important for your microbiome, and the oral microbiome particularly, we are rapidly discovering has an array of functions that determine everything from brain health to gut health more broadly. We're beginning to understand that, but also your oral microbiome defines how you taste and experience food. And in fact, it influences how you perhaps have the foods that you might crave and feelings around appetite. So I tend to brush my teeth after I've had my food because I want to experience that food. And those microbes are kind of an important way of doing that. But then also when I go out and start my day, I've got,
fresh teeth,
which I think is probably good for my patients because they probably don't want me breathing.
I love that. Okay. I'm going to try that.
Yeah.
I'm actually going to do a little experiment where I taste my coffee one day after brushing teeth and one day before, and just seeing, because I can in the morning, perhaps because I'm craving my black coffee first thing in the morning, even though I delay it a little bit. I hydrate before I caffeinate, that sort of thing I have in my mind. It just tastes incredible first thing in the morning. It's, I get the flavor profiles, and my mid-morning coffee after I've had breakfast in the day, I don't taste it as much. And I don't know why, whether it's because I'm not spending enough time with my coffee to get the tasting notes, or something actually has changed in my oral microbiome that leads me to taste it differently. Just a quick one. If you want to learn the 5 ingredients that I think are fantastic for inflammation that you should be getting into your diet every week, then download this PDF right now. It's in the link down there, and I'll send you my 5 ingredients for inflammation.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there might be a number of different reasons why that happens. Some of which do have something to do with the microbiome, some of which don't. But coffee has its own microbiome, right? So coffee beans, I mean, they literally have their own microbes that define their taste because they're manufactured through a process of fermentation, and you can define a coffee plant by its microbes, right? So there again, that sort of, it's another way through which you started this conversation by talking about climate change, and a key thing about the microbiome is that it literally connects us to our external environment, and coffee has reshaped planetary microbial ecosystems because we farm it on a massive scale, and everybody drinks coffee, right? We drink 2 billion cups of coffee a day. And coffee shapes your gut microbiome. 100% it shapes it. And what we know is that there's this super fine amount of coffee that you can drink, where actually if you drink 2 to 3 cups of coffee a day, it's really good for you. And if you drink a bit more of that, it suddenly isn't so good for you, right? So everything that you do, is connected, and your microbiome will absolutely influence how you taste and experience coffee, because there's an evolutionary partnership with it, right?
Yeah. I love my coffee.
Oh, me too. I won't take it away from you, I promise.
I can see why, 2 billion of us, or 2 billion cups are drunk a day. I'm definitely contributing a lot to that. You mentioned supplements in the morning and not having supplements first in the morning. What's the reason for that?
Well, I think the point that I'm making, and perhaps we'll talk about this a bit more, is that, you can't supplement your way to a healthy gut.
Sure.
Okay, so a healthy gut comes from a combination of factors, but the number one thing, and the key take-home message from this talk, is by having a diverse and varied diet, right? And we can talk about what that means, but by taking a massive stack, or as they sometimes refer to it in the social media world, of supplements, there's no shortcuts to that diverse and healthy diet. Some people need to take supplements, right? There are very good reasons why particular people might need and have to take supplements, and that's fine. And probably as a nation, we don't have enough vitamin D, and you can supplement in specific circumstances to enhance and protect your microbiome. So I do take on my cereal in the morning a bit of inulin and a bit of prebiotic fiber.
Inulin,
I just do that, and because I've measured my microbiome and shamefully it wasn't as diverse as I needed it to be, and that was an easy way that I could correct it. So that's what I do, and it works, and that's part of a nutritional and food-based strategy for changing it. But I think we fetishized supplements. Just to diverge a little bit. I was invited to give a lecture at VitaFoods Europe. I think it's called VitaFoods.
Okay.
VitaFoods. It's like this massive expo. It was in Geneva, right? I don't know, tens of thousands of people go. It's like this huge, vast sort of expo hall. And I walked around that and I just thought, why did I waste my time doing a PhD? Like, this is just a scienceless exercise of absolute, it's a bullshit fest of marketing nonsense where you can just make any health related claim about anything and stick it in a supplement. And it's just really, I don't know why I was shocked about it really. So I'm not saying that not all supplements have value, plainly some do. But there's a lot of mismarketing and mis-selling of these supplements, and there's a lot of misunderstanding how they actually have and derive a health benefit, because quite often those supplements are sold in combinations. You're not taking one thing, you're taking multiple things in a single product, and they interact. And those interactions with your gut and your microbes within your gut are often really complex and derive out of interactions between communities of microbes, most of which are very poorly understood. And very rarely do we give them in a targeted way, where we say, okay, we're going to measure something, we're going to note either a specific deficiency, or we're going to say, look, actually your microbiome really needs these things. We're going to give it, and then we're going to measure to prove that it has an actual benefit after the effect. Which to me is also kind of slightly backward. If we're saying that these things are really important for your health and you really should be taking them, well, then there should be some evidence, there should be some mechanism, and you should probably be measuring what you're doing. So I think just taking supplements blindly, expecting them to help your microbiome, is probably not helpful.
So you mentioned vitamin D, that is part of government guidance. At the top of this, we talked about probiotics and how they're definitely not something that you would suggest. And it is really tempting for a lot of people who consume that marketing information about foundational health, looking after your microbes, particularly with the rising, I don't know if you've seen the Google trends of gut health and the number of times that's typed into Google now. It's just like this massive mountain over the last 4 or 5 years. But you can understand why people fall prey to this ideal, this concept of probiotics in a supplemental form, and just taking that every day. Is there no evidence whatsoever that as a foundational supplement for everyone that would be beneficial?
So I'm not anti-probiotics.
Sure.
I advocate for probiotics in specific clinical use cases. I recommend probiotics to my patients in specific instances, and there is evidence. There's there's nearly 17,000 published studies of probiotic uses in multiple different clinical scenarios where they have real value. So I'm not saying that they are not in and of themselves, valuable. There is no question that there is mismarketing of probiotics. And that's largely because they're trying to bypass EU regulations around health claims that they can make. And they're selling into this nebulous wellness market, like whatever that is. I mean, who knows what the hell that is, right? So you can say whatever you want because it's wellness. And quite often these probiotics contain lots of sugars, and they contain lots of other stabilizers that go into those probiotics, which they don't really, shout quite so loud about. And there's very poor advice given around how to take probiotics. And we are very bad at targeting probiotics to specific people for specific reasons. And part of that is because we don't, quite a lot of that information is missing. We don't really know how to target them. Quite a lot of probiotic strains, so lactobacilli and BIFs and the bifidobacteria, are actually derived from non-human sources. They're not really designed to be in your gut. I don't
think a lot of people realize that.
They're not found in humans and discovered in humans because they're natural members of the human gut. They are artificially being placed into that gut. And this idea, I think many people think that you take a probiotic and suddenly your gut blooms into this diverse ecosystem. That's absolutely not what's happening, And you read these probiotic formulas and they say, it's got, 5 billion colony forming units. You think, well, God, that's a lot. But then you think about the fact you're dropping this into a community of 100 trillion bacteria. It's like a drop in the ocean. And it's maybe one strain or two strains or five strains, where there should be 500 or 1,000 strains or species. So these things don't necessarily change the community structure of the microbiome. They don't change the whole cell function of the microbiome, but they might have very specific health benefits in very specific use cases. For example, lowering cholesterol, right? Mm-hmm. So if you've got a high cholesterol, actually there's pretty good evidence that taking a regular probiotic, that means waking up and doing the opposite of what I've just said, taking it every day for at least a minimum of 12 weeks, and then measuring what your cholesterol was before and after and demonstrating it has an effect. Because if it doesn't have an effect, then you're wasting your money. You need a different strategy. And maybe you're on the wrong probiotic and maybe you need to change again. Mm-hmm. So I think I think the point that I'm trying to make is it's a nuanced topic and it's not a panacea.
Yeah.
Taking a probiotic, one of these kind of endlessly marketed probiotics, is not going to suddenly make your gut healthy, but it might have a very specific health benefit if you're taking it for the right reasons.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned there about having a clear starting point that's measurable, like cholesterol level, testing said supplement, in this case a probiotic, and then retesting, reinvestigating at 12 weeks to see if there's a desired effect, is something that's missing from a lot of supplement strategies that people have anyway. So whether they're taking magnesium or omega-3, they're not really thinking about this in a scientific way in their N of 1 experiment. And I think perhaps that's what the missing piece is for a lot of people with their supplement strategies.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're probably right. And that's why I recommend, to quite a lot of my patients and people that ask me about this, kefir, because kefir is cheap, number one. Like, these probiotics are really expensive, and quite often they're missold in these subscription models that just lock you in. They can be like 70 quid a bottle. It's insane. Some of the more kind of newer ones, they're just sold on hype, really. Whereas kefir is a couple of quid. Yeah. It's cheap as chips. It's probably got the majority of these good bugs that you really need anyway. Plus, it's got all of their fermentation products in there. So it's it's really a symbiotic. It's got prebiotic fibers and all of the other small molecules that they produce. And actually, you can put that on your milk and you can have it every day as part of a sustained behavior change. Okay. So if you want to have a healthy gut and a healthy microbiome, it's about doing things repeatedly over time, because that's what your microbes really need. It's an ecosystem. They need a sustainable environment that they can bloom and that they can grow in. So, actually getting into a habit where you're putting a bit of kefir on your cereal in the morning is actually probably a more sustainable way of doing it.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I use like sauerkrauts and kimchis in the morning as well.
Delicious,
just put it on toast, and that's it sounds pretty weird, I think, for some people who are used to cereal and all that kind of stuff. But for me, it kind of works really well. And not to labor the point on supplements, I know we haven't even got past breakfast here yet, but
it's going to be a long day.
Yeah, it's going to be a really long day. A lot of people are taking two powders, right? So whether that's a greens powder or it's a berry powder or a combination of, so some of them are, relatively minimally processed because there's a freeze drying and then, a low temperature heat processing, and then they just powder it, and you're getting like a diversity of, let's say, 10, 15, 20 different products that are derived from whole foods. Is there any benefit of those?
I come back to our earlier point. Like, if you're a healthy person, I would argue it's much better to have a balanced food intake that is diverse and has a food matrix. So microbes in your gut, they need the mechanical structure of food. It has value. Yeah. And this idea that you can recreate that through a powdered form is incorrect. Like, how the ingredients that you take and the way you cook and prepare food has a profound and important impact on your microbiome. And I would argue it's much better to have control of that and you'll end up with a healthier gut than to take these powdered foods. And the problem is that the people that consume massive amounts of these powdered foods are the people that least need to take them. Right. And invariably, in my clinical practice, they're young men in their 20s and 30s that rock up in my clinic and they go, well, I've got bloating and, I can't poo properly and I've got abdominal pain. And then, of course, for them, the use of these powders is so habitualized and so normalized, they don't even see it as being part of the problem. Right. So then what you've got to do is take a really super detailed history and then explain to them maybe these things aren't quite so good for their gut. Lo and behold, you stop it, everything gets better. Yeah. And what we're discovering is that these powdered products have unintended consequences on the microbiome. So you might be taking them for the best of reasons because they've got prebiotic fibers in them, because they've got, a bunch of, well-established, ingredients that have benefit. But actually, I was looking at this study on a study of casein and whey protein supplements, right, in powder form. Actually, you just get these big blooms in the virome. So the viruses in the gut just bloom out.
Wow.
And we don't know what that means. Like, we just don't understand the long-term consequences of that. It might be that actually it's having these unintended pro-inflammatory changes in the gut. And so
before we talk further about that, maybe we should just define exactly what we mean by the virome. Because I think a lot of people might have heard of bacteria in the gut, but they don't actually appreciate that there is also the virome, which is bigger, isn't it?
Yes, fair point. So a microbiome describes all of the microscopic life forms in an ecosystem and all of the things that they need to sustain their health. So that doesn't just mean bacteria. It means other kind of ancient but distinctly different microscopic organisms that look quite a lot of bacteria, but which are not, called the archaea. It looks like viruses. So these are kind of non-self-replicating. They're not technically alive forms of DNA or RNA. And we have lots of different types of viruses in the gut. And some of these viruses are called phage. And what phage do is infect bacteria.
Okay.
All right. And they are hugely important in the gut because they have a really big influence on how particular kingdoms of bacteria, grow and dominate and live in the gut. We also have eukaryotes. So eukaryotes are multicellular organisms. And this is where it kind of all gets a little bit, weird, because you've got multicellular organisms like worms and nematodes and these sorts of things that have their own guts with their own gut microbiomes living within your gut and your gut microbiome, right? So you've got, microbiomes within microbiomes. And all of these microbes...
Inception, that,
isn't it?
Yeah,
totally.
Yeah.
And all of these microbes are living in this dynamic community where you've got kind of trophic levels of food. So you've got, big bugs eating small bugs, right? And they're, in turn eating smaller bugs. And they're in this constant dynamic relationship where you have keystone, organisms, much like any other ecosystem. And, you've got equivalents of your kind of carnivores and your herbivores, right? And they're existing like this. So there's this dynamic interaction between these different forms of microscopic life forms. And they are constantly interacting with your gut and your immune system, and they're constantly producing small molecules as they interact with each other that are having a further impact on your gut. So it's this like wildly complicated system, And what we're just doing is dumping a bunch of powder on it and just expecting it all to be okay. Like it's madness, right? So of course there are unintended consequences because you have system complexity. And that's why like the microbiome is so important in understanding like individual health and personalized healthcare, because it's just so variable between people. And so I would argue that, taking these, like oh God, I don't want to be too, like every time I name a brand, I get into trouble. But like these, like Huel.
Yeah.
It upsets me so much. Like this idea.
We're not sponsored by Huel, so feel free to talk about
this idea that like we're just eating out of plastic containers in our lonely lives in our offices. Like it, I don't know. It just seems so regressive. Like
I know, yeah.
Oh,
yeah. And
don't do it.
I think what you described there, like the sort of, I have a lot of friends actually who have powders, and they also have IBS, and they text me and they're like, "What do I do?" I'm like, how many protein powders are you having? What else are you having every single day? What is habitual for you? Because those are usually the culprits that explain your symptoms. And the way you've described it in terms of the study looking at whey and casein and how that blooms the virome, and you just don't know what the downstream consequences of that are, that actually brings it to life for folks, I think. Because when you start disrupting that food matrix, and maybe we should step back and define what we mean by the food matrix, the complex 3D nature in which regular whole foods exist naturally. When you break that down, you're essentially pre-digesting a lot of food that your microbes would have had to work towards, and therefore, you're leading to a bloom of other microbes down the digestive tract.
But the structure of food also means it has a set of chemical and physical properties that have health benefits irrespective of the microbiome. So they absorb toxins, they absorb bile acids, they help you absorb vitamins, they help you absorb essential nutrients, right? So there's a key part of this that's got nothing to do at all with the microbiome, that actually you just need it, and you need it in your gut. And then it's super important. But I think it also comes back, just to kind of take a step back, just sort of reflecting on what you were saying. Like, I think we've got a very warped sense of what health norms are. So for example, like a lot of young people, are obsessed with the gains, and they want to be in the gym, and they've got this idea of what physical health is, right? And to them, physical health means muscle gain, it means muscle mass, and it means maybe aerobic fitness, it means this sort of fitness. But that is quite different from gut health, right? That is not the same thing, right? And you need to understand that if you're following an extreme nutritional intervention, and to me, an extreme nutritional intervention is sustaining yourself on powders, then there will be unintended consequences for your gut, and they will not necessarily always be healthy. And here's the kicker. Those things will not manifest themselves, for 10 or 20 years. So you will be fine tomorrow. You'll be fine the day after. You might get a bit of gut bloating, you might get a bit of IBS. The consequence comes when you've been doing that in a sustained way for a really long period of time. And the other thing that I ask myself is, and again, I see this a lot in my clinical practice, particularly with like disorders of gut-brain interaction. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, in a bit. But if you're one of these people and you're trying to biohack your way into a healthy gut, like, you need to ask yourself, well, okay, why am I doing that? And is there something else that's underlying this, that's potentially driving it? So what I'm getting at here is that quite often in these situations, actually there's an underlying breakdown in people's relationship with food that's driving all of this. And actually, until you address this, you can't move anything forward.
Yeah, it's a really, really important point. And I want to underline that, because we talked about it, we touched on it in our previous conversation. And I think that link between our mental well-being, our sense of self, our community, our purpose, these are so linked to good gut health. And actually, instead of looking at the answer in a packet or a powdered food, we should actually be looking internally and actually our psychological well-being.
Yeah, 100%. And again, like, the microbiome science is about looking beyond the packet of food. It's about understanding where that food has come from, because the microbiome connects us to our environment. So it's about asking, where has that been food grown? What has been sacrificed in terms of the soil and the planetary microbiome to produce that food or to grow that animal that you're consuming? And it's about asking what ownership I'm prepared to take over the selection of my own ingredients and how I'm going to prepare those ingredients, who I'm going to share that food with, and the kind of enjoyment that I'm going to take out of that food. And in modern life, we're just desperately looking for shortcuts. Because we don't want to solve the underlying problem. And then what happens is you rock up in my clinic going, my gut doesn't work. And that's the problem, right? There are no shortcuts here, because, to my earlier point, you're dealing with a living ecosystem. Right? You are as much bacteria at a cellular level as you are human. Which means you've got to treat these microbes with respect, and that means you're in it for the long haul. That means nurturing them from early life and living with them as part of a genuine, meaningful, symbiotic partnership for the duration of your life. And if you're drowning yourself in powders, then you're not doing that.
Yeah. Such a good point. We're going to move off the breakfast table into our commute. On that note, actually, do you have a mindfulness practice or a gratitude practice in the morning? I mean, your mornings are probably going to be pretty stretched at this point, once you had a kiss with your wife and a lovely breakfast with your kids.
She's not going to let me forget that. So I want to tell you that I do.
Sure.
Honestly, like, I don't have a kind of regular mindfulness practice, but my mindfulness that I've tried to focus on is cycling. That was my thing, right? I'm just too agitated and restless, and that's my makeup. So, but I find that the only way I can be mindful is to engage in a repetitive activity that means I physically cannot do anything else.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So when I'm on my bike, I can only cycle. I can't text, I can't email.
Yeah.
And it's really, really good for me because I'm exercising, and this is going to sound really peculiar, so forgive me, but like I need the sort of physical exertion to kind of go into that space of
totally
just emptying my mind.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But also, like, I can do it with my friends. So like it's oh God, it's such an embarrassing cliche, but because I am a mammal, it's pathetic. But actually, you're on the road with your friends and you're having a chit chat about stuff that really doesn't matter, and you come back after an hour, and that's my mindfulness. I feel invigorated. I feel great. And I've just had a moment of escape. So that's what
Absolutely.
I do.
That's, I mean, look, a lot of folks use exercise as a form of meditation. Actually, a lot of my medic friends have that as well, whether it's running or cycling or, if you're an anaesthetist, it's a triathlon or marathon running,
amazing.
That kind of stuff. Yeah.
Well, again, there's that famous quote about why do you do triathlons? Well, it's so I don't descend into alcoholism, and it's probably true.
Yeah.
But on a different note, like I do prescribe and recommend hypnotherapy as part of my treatment, because when you're dealing with gut-brain problems, like, the brain is an opportunity to heal and treat the gut. And I'm sure we'll talk about the mechanisms through which it works, but we've got randomized control trial data, level 1 evidence that actually these things really do meaningfully help. And whether you do that through an app or whether you do that, through, yoga or whatever it is that you do, you just keep doing it. It's so, so important, I think, to do it. So I'm a very strong advocate of it.
Fab. Commuting. So we're commuting to work now, whether it's in a hospital or office or whatever.
Yeah.
Are there things that we need to be mindful of if we're trying to nurture our microbes as best as possible?
Well, I think given our thing we just talked about, if you can take some physical exercise in that commute to work, I would strongly advocate for it. That might not be running or cycling, but it might mean walking to the train station instead of getting that bus. A 15 to 20 minute walk. You're doing that every single day. The health consequences, the health benefits for you are numerous. And again, many of those things have got absolutely nothing to do with the microbiome, but they will really, really help. Yeah. And I think it's as much about what you don't do as what you do. So it's about not snacking, right? So and I speak from my own personal behaviors on that. Like, to me, that was a ripe time for snacking. So really trying to avoid that sort of unhealthy behavior. And again, spending that time, perhaps that's an opportunity for mindfulness, isn't it? I mean, doing that, using that time constructively rather than, so optimizing gut brain rather than embracing and enduring the quite stressful activity of commuting, like taking the tube, like, it's quite stressful. Like, so if you can find ways to empower yourself to de-stress that situation, I think that's also super helpful.
I'm reading in between the lines here, but in between your meals, is it advisable to give your gut a rest, essentially? So not grazing between meals and not snacking, like you were saying, during your commute and perhaps during the working day as well?
Again, so I think there's no one size fits all. And your question assumes you're healthy with a gut that's not symptomatic and you don't have other healthcare problems. And there might be reasons why actually sitting down and eating 3 big meals a day is not the right thing for you. But I think if you're generally healthy, avoiding snacking is a good thing. And actually what you find is that your microbes, particularly in your small bowel, they bloom out with each meal that you have, right? So, again, what microbes want is that kind of general sustenance that comes in cycles. That's what they've evolved to deal with.
Okay, so they're sort of trained according to the circadian rhythm, our sleep-wake cycle.
Yeah, but also the rhythm through which you eat and through which you consume food. And I think what you
so there should be some regularity as to when we eat.
I think so, but I think what we see in the kind of the world of social media is lots of people who've got very strong belief systems around this, and you see lots of people recommending and proposing quite radical diets as a way to kind of change your health or optimize your health, like the keto diet, for example, or various other kind of high protein diets. And the thing that I would say is that if you have a radical diet like that and you really change the pattern of your eating, it will obviously impact on how you feel and various aspects of your health. Some of them might be positive, like a keto diet, you'll lose a lot of weight, right? And for some people, that might be a really, really good thing. But these things are not sustainable diets. They're not things that are going to give you long-term gut health, and they're not things that I would necessarily subscribe to. The one, I suppose, the one diet which perhaps doesn't conform to that rule is fasting and intermittent fasting.
Okay.
So intermittent fasting has really well evidenced health benefits, and for some people it's very, very effective. And it works through multiple different, routes. But one of the things that you do when you fast is that you just very significantly and dramatically reduce the absolute abundances of microbes in your gut, both in the foregut and in the hindgut. Okay. And within 24 hours, you'll see a massive dying off of these microbes, because they need to eat every day just like you do. Okay. And that can sometimes be quite beneficial.
Okay. In what way would it be negative? So maybe before we go into that, maybe we should define exactly what we mean by intermittent fasting, because my understanding of the literature is that it's quite a vague term. It can be anything from water fasting for 24, 48 hours, all the way to what is probably more correctly termed as time restricted feeding, which is where you eat in a defined window of, let's say, 10 or 11 hours throughout a 24 hours. So you don't change the caloric intake in your day. In one instance, you just change when you choose to consume calories.
Exactly right. And I think that's part of the problem, is that these things are poorly standardized. Sure. And therefore it's quite difficult to measure the impact and the consequences of changing your diet like that.
Gotcha. And when folks are fasting, let's say they do a more aggressive fast of 24 hours, in what cases would it be negative? Aside from the fact that you're not taking in the macronutrients of protein, let's say, and you're under muscled, under fueled, etc. If you were doing that regularly, where would you fall into some traps?
Well,
because it is becoming popular.
Yeah, it's becoming popular. Yeah. So I think that it becomes a problem when you effectively become malnourished, right? And that definitely does happen. So you see people who perhaps are slightly over obsessing maybe in this because they really believe that it's going to give them long-term health benefits, and actually they just tip the other way and they end up malnourished. So I work with a dietitian, and my first job is to get them to a dietitian and to give them a proper nutritional assessment to make sure that actually they're not malnourished. And the problem is that you then quite quickly become depleted in essential vitamins, essential amino acids and small molecules that your gut really, really needs. And that's a problem, because if you lose too many microbes, it's the microbes that provide a lot of these things, right? Yeah. So, vitamins A, D, E, K, for example. So you need microbes, you need them, right? So if you go too far the other way, you just can't sustain yourself. Yeah. You can't sustain your muscle mass, and it becomes a problem. Like starvation is plainly a bad thing. So it's maintaining that balance. And it's also not obsessing so much about nutrition and diet and thinking about these other broader things that we've talked about.
You mentioned keto, and there are other high protein diets where very high protein and low carbohydrate, so it's imbalanced in what we would deem an ideal diet, which is something Mediterranean styled. Why do you think some people are thriving on these diets, and do you think they're short-term gains for potential long-term consequences if you to stick to these diets over the course of years?
Yeah, so I think if you're going to a sort of radical, red meat diet or high protein diet, you're biohacking your gut, and you're going to see very dramatic and sudden physical transformations, which can in the short term be very, very appealing. But I would strongly counsel against doing these things as a sustainable way for gut health, because animal proteins in particular are fermented in the gut, right? Your colon is a fermenting engine, and a byproduct of excessive animal protein fermentation is the generation of very toxic small molecules, which we know are really bad for the gut. So, these are paracresols, they're sulfides, they're all of these nasties they're frankly, they're not just pro-inflammatory, they're carcinogenic. And again, it's what we came back to before. It's what we said about, you're going to make those nutritional changes and the health consequences for you, because it's going to influence your risk of non-communicable disease. It's going to be down the track and down the road. Your gut needs fiber, and it needs a diverse diet, because without that, you cannot have a diverse microbiome. Mm-hmm. And without a diverse microbiome, you cannot have the resilience in the gut, and you cannot have a healthy brain. You cannot have a healthy immune system. You cannot have all of these kind of other healthy axes that the gut is so profoundly and linked into, like gut lung, gut liver, all these sorts of things. So these things are dangerous. You should not be doing them. And if you're doing it, you need to perhaps ask yourself why you're making those decisions. So yeah, I would strongly advocate against them.
Okay. Let's move on to lunch.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, we talked a lot about food already,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
we'll move on to lunchtime and what you're doing during work time.
Sure.
Are there practices that you think we should be thinking around this time of day in particular, from the lens of what we're doing to look after our gut?
So I think that again, beyond common sense things that many of your listeners will already be doing, no, not particularly. So I think looking at the types of food that you consume at lunchtime, given that actually what you're trying to do is to give yourself enough energy to focus and get through your afternoon of work or physical activity into the afternoon, and having, again, a balance of foods and a diverse lunch. So having a varied lunch, so each time maybe thinking about shaking up, trying to eat the same thing over and over again isn't such a good thing. Making sure that you have your 5 portions of fruit and vegetables in that is really, really critical, and avoiding ready-made, ready-prepared foods is really key. And again, avoiding minimizing, I should say, ultra-processed foods in your consumption would be kind of fairly standard advice. But I think that's something that most of your listeners will already know and probably already do.
Yeah, you're a medic, right?
Yeah,
you worked in plenty of hospitals.
I have.
You know what we have available to us. It's pretty dire. It's usually a meal deal.
Yeah.
A lot of people face this choice every single day because of the lack of options or the high price point of some of the healthier options.
Yeah.
What are simple things that perhaps you do?
Yeah.
We talked about inulin and how you sprinkle that on your breakfast and stuff. Are there simple things or strategies that you've come across either through your work with patients or perhaps, ideas from the dietitians that you work with to help people achieve some of that diversity, the 5 a day and the
well, there's a very good app, Rupy, which I strongly adhere to. I think so when I became vegetarian, which I've just done it. I mean, God, that was smug.
When did you turn vegetarian?
I can only apologize. I was vegetarian before COVID.
Oh, okay.
And then when COVID happened, I thought I was going to die. I thought, well, I better have a steak. and then I couldn't get back on the vegetarian wagon.
Okay.
And then I just found it so hard to get back onto it. So I've just gone back on again, like the end of last year. And what I've found is that if you're trying to make healthy food choices and you're trying to diversify your diet, it's having the repertoire of foods and understanding the choice that you have and the access to those foods.
Yeah.
So part of the problem is simply knowing where to go to get that variety and having some help in doing that. So my piece of advice to you is to do it with someone. If you're doing this on your own, it's so hard. But if you're doing it in a little group of buddies on a Snapchat or a group or a WhatsApp group, whatever your kind of platform is, and you've got that level of support, it suddenly becomes so much easier. So if you're connected and you're sharing recipes and you're sharing food stuff and you're sharing food ideas, it's much easier to get into a sustained pattern of behavior change. And I found that to be incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
So again, this is like, I don't know, this is such a personal observation and it's not grounded in any form of science. Like I really try and stop online shopping because when I online shop, what happens is the algorithm just gives me stuff that they think I need and I can't get that variety. Yeah. So what I try and do is I try and really understand who I'm buying food for, and I try and go to people that I know to buy food from. Yeah. And I try and do it in person.
Yeah.
And I find there's lots of good reasons for doing that. And again, like, oh man, this is such a middle class thing to say, but like the local farmers market, like, I'm so sorry, I'm that guy. It's expensive. I appreciate that not everyone can do these things and you may not have access to it. But actually, when I go there, I find it brilliant. There's a sense of community. I know where the food is coming. Every day there's fresh produce in that market, which I perhaps wouldn't have thought about, which I can bring into my repertoire. I can chat to my mates who are in the same kind of mental zone as me, and it gives me that diversity. And then when I cook for two. Not because I'm eating for two, but because I know that there's going to be food left over that I can take to work with me tomorrow. So I don't have to go to the shop where all the ultra processed foods are that I know that I want to eat.
Yeah, yeah.
The other thing that I did is that I've given up fizzy drinks.
Okay.
So I had a minor low level addiction to Haribo. It wasn't low level. It was like I was totally dependent on Haribo, right? And because it gets me through a work shift.
I was literally going to say that.
Yeah. So when I'm exhausted, I'm at work. Like when I'm operating, like if I'm doing nights and I come out of a night shift, like forget coffee, forget any other stimulants, like a bag of Haribo, I'm high as a kite, right? And I can go for hours. But I just plainly that's terrible, right? And it's full of Red 14, God knows what else. So I was like, okay. That's got to go. So I gave up Haribo and I gave up fizzy drinks. So actually another major kind of thing that I've observed in my own kind of life is I have to think very carefully about the fluids I drink and what I'm going to drink and what I bring to work, because you want something that is tasty, that's nice to drink. And I don't want to drink, kind of Diet Coke anymore. Yeah. And I found that's even harder than giving up alcohol. Like really? To me, I found that so difficult, but I just feel so much better. And we just know from lots and lots of evidence that actually these, fizzy carbonated drinks, they cause lots of harm and they're associated with lots of, non-communicable disease risk. We know it changes the microbiome. It's so important for your gut health. So for me, lunchtime, no fizzy drinks, no snacks, try and make my own food. And I try and make that food myself and bring it in.
I love that. And it's so funny you mentioned Haribo, because it's like the emergency pack that most medics have and rely on. It's always at the nurse's station.
I'm not proud of it.
And you know what? I love the fact that you're being super honest about this, because, when I was a junior doctor, it's exactly the same thing that I was reliant on as well. Yeah. And it's happening across the country, and loads of people are probably nodding their head and like, that's me. And I can't get off them. And it's hard because you get that sugar. Well, you lose the stimulant effect, and you can get headaches and stuff, especially if you're drinking full fat Coke. Yeah. My question around fizzy drinks was, a lot of people go from full sugar to artificially sweetened fizzy drinks as sort of a go-between, because the other options are water, and most people, when you suggest water to them, they look at you blankly as if you've just suggested going on a 48-hour fast. What are your opinions on artificially sweetened fizzy drinks as a means to sort of coming off the high sugar?
Yeah, I just I think you've got to go full cold turkey. It's like giving up smoking. I just think it's like it's a halfway house, and you're just, because I think whilst sugar has a more kind of and particularly caffeinated beverages have a more addictive, physically, biologically addictive component to it. Actually, it's about behavior. It's about sustained behavior change, even if so for me, what I found was actually it was more about the fact that I just had 15 or 20 minutes and I could go down to the shop and I could buy a can of Diet Coke, and that just became it just became a pattern of behavior. And so I think actually it's about changing your pattern of behavior. And I would push back and say that actually you don't just have to drink water, you can be creative about it. And there are lots of healthier drinks and lots of healthier options that you can have. But carbonated fizzy drinks, they're just very plainly not very good for you. And we just drink way too many of them. Yeah. And I think removing them from your diet is a critical thing.
Electrolytes in drinks. This is a relatively new sort of phenomena within the wellness sphere. I definitely see it from the perspective of, if you're cycling, having electrolyte replacement drink that doesn't have any sugar in, or a small amount of sugar, can be beneficial. What do you make of the electrolytes trend at the moment? Do you think this is harmful to our guts? Do we not know enough?
The honest truth is that I probably don't know enough about that, and to give you an informed opinion on it. But I think that, again, what you're seeing is a slightly obvious trend, which is that it's just marketing. Like, I seriously doubt there's any credible evidence that these things, are either really beneficial for your health, which is kind of the claims that they're making, again, in the wellness space, this nebulous wellness space, whatever that is. And it's intuitive to me that if you're consuming massive amounts of electrolytes, that it's probably not that great for you, right? Now, having said that, there's a time and a place for them. And if you're an athlete, or if you're doing lots of exercise, or you're really dehydrated because you've got traveler's diarrhea, they're really good. You should definitely have them, right? But this idea that you regularly consuming these things is going to somehow magic your gut into a healthy space is, I don't think, very credible. And I think you're seeing like really worrying practices with, drinks like Prime and these sorts of things, that they're actually being marketed to kids.
Yeah.
Right. So what we're trying to do is to seed these super unhealthy practices into children, because what we absolutely know is through egregious marketing practices that if you can do that, these kids will just, that's it. They're addicted for life. So that's the bit that worries me.
Yeah. We're in the bulk of the afternoon. Okay. We're in front of our computer.
Yeah.
And what I've noticed from folks is they sit by their computer and they have email apnea. So they literally stop breathing. And it's a phenomena that I think is becoming more well recognized now. And obviously you have a lot of stress build up. And aside from the fact that you're hunched over your desk, you're not going outside and you're not getting fresh air, you're not moving your body, you're not doing micro stretching. Is there anything in that arena where we can actually look after our guts better, and other practices to mitigate against stress that can have an impact on our...
So I think sort of just to perhaps diverge away from a little bit of what you're getting at, because physical activity is plainly important. I think thinking about the office space more broadly is really important. So many of us work from home. Like a lot of that's happened after COVID, and you might be at your computer in quite an isolated way, actually. And being physically connected in an office, I think, is quite a good thing. I appreciate my view might not be widely held by people that work at home, but I think being physically connected with a group of people is actually very beneficial. So making time to kind of go for a cup of coffee or to go and see your colleagues is actually very good. And it comes back down to that piece we were talking about before about being physically connected, right? But also think about the environment that you work in. Like you have a plant on our desk, right? Actually, this is a really important part of how we reconnect with our microbiome, because the place where you spend the majority of your working life directly influences your microbiome. So if your office environment is super sterile and you're smothered in alcohol all of the time, that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing for your skin. It's not a good thing. I'm not saying hygiene isn't good. Like hygiene is good. Please wash your hands. Like we like this. It's a good thing. But actually, you should have plants in your office space. Like you should have a connection to nature in your office space, because that promotes your not just a healthy gut. It's good for all aspects of your health.
Yeah. I'm trying to get more plants in our office as we speak, but I have a habit of killing them, unfortunately, and we just don't look after them very well.
You're not alone.
No. Okay, we're at home.
Yeah.
We've had a lovely day full of fruits and vegetables and fiber. When you eat dinner, should we be having a lighter dinner? This is a common question we get on socials. So that to improve our sleep or to improve any other aspects of our gut microbiome, is that?
Well, we definitely shouldn't be eating late. So I think you want to eat 3 or 4 hours ideally before you go to bed, because that's going to definitely, influence your ability to have a good night's rest. And I think it's much more important to think about the quality of what you're eating rather than the quantity, or kind of rather obviously. So if you're having foods that are full of stimulants and full of refined sugars and these sorts of things, very plainly that's going to be much worse for you than having a big volume of food. And portion control is something that we perhaps should all think about. So for me, the short answer is quality much more than quantity.
Yeah. And do you suggest gut health wind down routines in the evening, things to help soothe our gut from all the stimulants that we've had during the day, the stresses of the day, the commute, all that kind of stuff?
I don't particularly, but maybe that's because I'm just not very familiar with them. And I think, I think again, if you've got a resilient, happy microbiome through sustained practices, those things shouldn't really be necessary, right? So I think the danger with this is that you can become obsessive about it, and that actually you stop having enjoyment and fulfillment, because a key part of gut health is having fun, being happy in yourself and in the moment, and not obsessing about your gut, right? And I spend a lot of time trying to undo people's obsessions with their guts, right? So what's much more important is that you go and hang out with your friends, and that you just take some time to be in the moment with someone, and actually be, I'm not that kind of straight, like if you're happy working in the evening, work in the evening. If it brings you enjoyment and happiness and you're in your work for the right reasons, great. If you're working at night because you're miserable, because your boss is being a dick and you've got a million things to do, well, that's not good for any aspect of your health, let alone your gut, and you really need to stop those behaviors. So I think it's much more about being content in the choices that you've made in the day, and knowing that actually you just got some time to be your best self, whatever that is, whatever you choose that to be. I think it's a healthier way.
I love that. I think it's so important because, I know I've structured this conversation almost like a gut health protocol, but it really, I'm glad you've emphasized the point that we're all different. And I think it's the way you approach your day through the lens of joy and happiness that actually has the beneficial effect on your gut health, rather than being rigid and stuck or maintaining diligence according to a set sort of routine that someone else has built for you, instead of actually being intuitive about it.
I think there's kind of one other thing that I would add to this list of things that we've done in our day. And perhaps this has got nothing to do with food, which is that I would try and avoid taking any medicines that were not absolutely necessary.
Interesting.
So for me, that is probably the more important thing when you're talking about microbes specifically, right? So many of your listeners will be healthy and will not need to take medicines. Some of you might be listening to this and you might be on medicines for very specific diseases or healthcare problems where actually you really need to be on those medicines, right? It might be immunotherapy for inflammatory bowel disease, or it might be, I don't know, a cancer treatment in an extreme case. Just keep taking those medicines. Those are great. But sometimes we take medicines when we just really don't need to, because we don't want to do the work, right? And sometimes we take medicines because we become slightly reliant on them. So good examples of that would be, paracetamol, ibuprofen. Like, we just consume massive amounts of it, right? So you gave the example of being at the computer and getting, you get a headache, right? So rather than taking your paracetamol, stop, go away, hydrate, take a minute, right? Don't take the medicine. And enormous amounts of us take antidepressants. We take medicines that are designed to give us shortcuts to the problems of urbanized modern livings, like statins for too much cholesterol and medicines to regulate our blood pressure. They're evidence-based, they're important medicines. Some people need to be on them, but some of us don't want to do the work. And what we know is that polypharmacy, taking all of these drugs, has a really big impact on the gut. Mm-hmm. And it means that we're going further and further away from actually making meaningful changes that solve the underlying problem. So a lot of the time it's about trying to really focus on addressing the underlying issue and giving yourself meaningful, sustainable solutions to those problems, because the drugs that you're taking are probably damaging the gut and perpetuating that cycle.
Yeah.
And, I get a lot of patients that come to see me, they're taking medicines to regulate, they're taking antacids or proton pump inhibitors. They're on a bunch of painkillers, ibuprofen being the classic one. Because they've been on ibuprofen, they're taking the proton pump inhibitor, and then, then they're taking a bunch of medicines to try and help their bloating, and then they're taking a bunch of medicines because they've been a bit depressed about this, and then they're just stuck. They can't get out of it. So we've got to break the cycle on our reliance on these medicines because they damage the gut. And, now when I see my patients in my clinic, I will take a pharmacological history anyway, but I'm now increasingly screening for things like Ozempic.
Interesting.
Because these are becoming slightly more malignant forms of kind of bypassing that chronic disease problem, right? And Ozempic is a drug of abuse that is basically being taken by people off license, being purchased on the internet because it's a shortcut to solving all of the problems that we've just talked about, to weight loss, to changing your behaviors. And these things profoundly affect the gut and the way the gut works. And people don't want to talk about it. So they'll come and they'll see me and for them, it's like a dirty secret that they don't want to admit to.
Interesting.
And you have to say, well, yeah, you've got diarrhea and you've got constipation, you've got bloating, you've got abdominal pain because you're on Ozempic. And if you're really, there'll always be a paradox. They'll say to me, I really want to have a microbiome that's healthy. Can we do a microbiome test? And I'm like, yeah, we can do a microbiome test, but there's absolutely no point unless you're really committed to changing these things.
Yeah.
So like the big message here is there's no shortcuts in this. You can only hack your way out of this to a degree. And we as a society have got to facilitate and help people to do that. And actually the biggest determinant of your gut microbiome's health are probably the drugs and the medicines that you take. And of course, the biggest one of those is antibiotics. But, that's a subtly different thing. You're not going to take them every day.
Just to double click on Ozempic for a second. What happens and I appreciate people are buying this off license and they are abusing it and they're taking it well outside the current guidelines for Ozempic. What do we understand what happens when people take Ozempic and shifts in our microbial population? Do we fully appreciate that?
So perhaps just a brief explainer of what we mean by Ozempic. So Ozempic is a type of medicine that you take, which is an agonist for a particular type of hormone in the gut. So an agonist means it potentiates and upregulates a particular type of hormone, which is called an incretin. And these are hormones that are kind of anorexogens. So what they do is they suppress appetite, they suppress some of those food-seeking behaviors. And one of those is called GLP-1. Some of these medicines, they don't just block that one particular hormone. They don't potentiate, they don't accentuate that one particular hormone. They might accentuate 2 or 3 different hormones, right? So what they do is there's something called the colonic break. So when you eat a meal, those hormones are secreted and they say, okay, guys, don't need any more food now. We can shut down your appetite. You're not going to be hungry for a bit. And what these hormones do is they just accentuate the colonic break and they keep you feeling like you're just not interested in food the whole time. And one of these drugs, is called Ozempic. There's others called Mounjaro, and Mounjaro has, multiple hormones that it blocks, not just one. And they're amazingly good at treating things like type 2 diabetes, and they're amazingly good at, promoting weight loss. What many people don't realize is that these hormones, their function is in part determined by microbes in the gut. So microbes in the gut influence how all of these hormones work because they also produce lots of other small molecules that influence how the cells that make those hormones function and how those hormones work when they get to the brain. So there is an intimate link between gut health and these hormones. And that's why when you take these hormones, you can develop symptoms of diarrhea, incontinence in the worst cases, abdominal pain and bloating and cramps. And it's also why we see complications like inflammation in the pancreas and these other problems. So it is intuitive that when you start to take them, your microbiome changes. It has to change. The question is whether it changes for the better or for the worse. And my hunch is it's not for the better. We've had 1 or 2 studies that have looked at this, and they're too early to really tell whether they're meaningful because they're all short term.
Right.
And what we're really interested in is what happens in the long term. And I'm deeply concerned that these drugs are going to have a very long lasting impact on our health that we don't properly understand yet. So a lot of the science that's coming out is very positive, and they're kind of wonder drugs. Yeah. But I'm worried that because most of these medicines are actually not being taken inside of trials where we're really understanding what their longer term impact is, that 5, 10, 15 years down the track, we're going to discover, there's a whole bunch of side effects that we didn't realize about. And really they're drugs. The reason I call them drugs of abuse is that they don't solve the underlying problem. They just suppress your appetite. So you come off them, what happens? Well, you gain all that weight again. Yeah. And many of the patients that I find that I'm interacting with in my practice that take them, basically, they already have some underlying addictive traits. They all have some underlying relationship with their food, which is not entirely healthy. Quite often, there's a history of eating disorders at some level. And for them, this just allows them to promote that. And I think these things are troubling to me. And I don't think they're part of the discussion yet, really, around how we use these products.
Do you class them in the same way you would bariatric surgery and other bariatric interventions? Or do you think this is a separate intervention in itself because of the ease at which people can access them? and their efficacy?
So they're very, very different. So weight loss surgery, works by two different mechanisms. One is a kind of a restrictive mechanism, all right? So you stop simply the volume of calories and food you can put in.
Sure.
And the second way is by malabsorption. It's stopping you absorbing those foods. Mm-hmm. And actually weight loss surgery has a really dramatic and important, impactful effect on gut health, which is, again, like very badly defined. So we studied this we published a paper on this many, many years ago, showing that in patients who have weight loss surgery, their feces, their fecal water is highly genotoxic. Like it just, by that, what I mean is, like, if you try and culture cells in this fecal water, they just all die, right? God. And what we see is this kind of paradox in that weight loss is supposed to be an important determinant of health, but actually in patients having these weight loss surgeries, actually their risk of bowel cancer goes up. It doesn't go down.
Wow.
And we don't really know why that is, but we think the microbiome is an important determinant of it. And these drugs work by a very different route, right? So I think we should not be performing, weight loss surgery is not a panacea to a global obesity pandemic, right? And taking a medicine potentially is. Although it works for a different way, of course, it also isn't a panacea because we're not solving the underlying problem. And therein lies the challenge, because these drugs, fabulously expensive, they're making a small number of people wealthy beyond their wildest dreams, right? And the rich are getting richer and the poorer are still obese. And when it's diverting our attention from what we should really be thinking about. And you asked me a question at the very beginning of this chat, like, do microbes influence your susceptibility to obesity? 100% they do. And I don't know if we talked about this last time, but like, if you go back to the 1940s, like the very first papers on streptomycin, when antibiotics were very, very first discovered, one of the first things that we did was give them to chickens. Because we were coming out of the Second World War and we had a food crisis. And we gave them to chickens because we wanted animals to not die of infectious diseases so that we could get more chickens to market. And the first thing that we noticed is they got fatter. When you trash your microbiome, you become susceptible to weight gain, because you drive inflammation up, and that changes your sensitivity to insulin, and you become obese. So again, like, I feel like we are not fixing the problem of the internal climate crisis. We're just giving ourselves very, very profitable solutions that keep people trapped in an endless cycle of drug dependency to solve a problem which is caused by drugs. And that, to me, doesn't seem like a good solution.
When you frame it like that, it just sounds bonkers, doesn't it? And unfortunately, a lot of people find themselves in that cycle where they are looking for shortcuts. And I think if there's a theme of this podcast, is don't go for the shortcuts. Really think about the long-term play here. I want to be mindful, because I know you've got an MDT straight after this. So we're going to go through some of the quick fire questions that I had, and influence as well from our community. Asking for a friend. Children in the early years. So for parents of newborns, let's say 15 weeks, what are some of the most important things that we can do to set up our kids for lifelong gut health? And secondary question, and perhaps you've already answered this earlier, should we be thinking about probiotics for children, particularly newborns who are on formula?
So I've brought up two children somehow. I don't know how I did it. Like, there were days when I was not, an excellent parent. So,
by the way, I noticed that you've got adolescent kids when you mentioned Snapchat. And I was thinking in my head, I haven't thought about Snapchat for years.
That minefield is coming, and we'll have another podcast about that in due course, because it's a minefield. But like, my first and number one thing is just don't feel guilty about it. Like, we're all doing the best that we possibly can. And there's so much conflicting advice, and, you make your choices, and that's okay. You're a parent. And if you're listening to this podcast, you've automatically selected yourself as a good parent. So just keep doing what you're doing. So everything that I'm going to say comes with that caveat, right? So number one is breastfeed, 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 right? So there are a million good reasons why you should be doing this. It's important for maternal health. There's just endless evidence that it's good for almost every parameter of long-term health, gut function being number one, because it seeds the microbiome, right? And it feeds the microbiome. You get these big blooms of biffs. So by that, I mean is, you need to breastfeed for at least 6 months. And then ideally intermittently breastfeed for the first 2 years.
Okay.
All right. Because
2 years.
2 years, wow. Right. Which is a long time. And I appreciate that not all women can do that. And that, women, this is a really complex political issue and there's lots of nuance in it.
Yeah.
And that not all women can. If you can't and you've got to formula feed your child, well, okay, there's probably reasons why you're doing that. But if you've got the choice and you can, you really should be doing it. And we should be promoting that much more. And so that's my number one. Number two is absolutely avoid the unnecessary use of antibiotics.
Okay.
Antibiotics are life-saving medicines. There will be times when your kid needs an antibiotic. Give the antibiotic. Don't feel guilty about it. But if you're at the GP and your GP says you don't need antibiotics, you don't need antibiotics, right? And they are not a panacea. They should be your last medicine of resort. So don't take them, because the impact of taking these antibiotics, if they are not needed, will be potentially lifelong. Number three is try and get into a kind of behavior around food early on, which promotes food choices where, well, let me rephrase. Try and get into a pattern where your child really enjoys making and preparing food and understands that having a diverse and varied diet is important for them. So food should be play, and they should really enjoy playing with their food, and they should enjoy making food with other children. And what you want to get out of is this culture of ultra-processed food, and try and give them a defense against the egregious marketing of foods, right? So these are carrot crisps. They're not carrot crisps, they're crisps, right? And so it's about educating yourself about that, so your child has some sort of defense against it as they age.
Yeah.
And the fourth thing is, right, just make your kids socialize as much as they possibly can.
Yeah.
Right. They need to be with other kids. I know what it's like as a parent. Like, I've been that guy, and you drop your kid at the nursery and then immediately they have chicken pox, right? And you're like, oh God, now I can't go to work and it's getting impact on me. But actually, they're not just sharing pathogens, they're sharing symbiotes, they're sharing mutualist microbes that diversify their microbiome and give them defense, and they need it, right? Yeah. So they've got to socialize.
With regard to COVID, I know a lot of kids born in that era obviously were isolated. Have we seen, it's quite early to tell 5 years later, have we seen any downstream consequences of that isolation on our kids' microbes? Do
you know what? I think I haven't seen strong evidence for that, so I can't really speak to that. I mean, clearly we've seen psychological consequences of that period of isolation. It's been very dramatic, and I think there's lots of evidence for that. But the role the microbiome has in it, I don't know. What we are beginning to understand is that if you interrupt the assembly of the microbiome in early life, and you do that at critical moments in development, the long-term consequences for things like brain development, for your ability to have kind of other normal functioning organs, becomes quite significantly perturbed. And it seems to be really important. And increasingly, I'm of the belief that actually, if you want to understand a condition like bowel cancer, which is what I do in my day job, you have to understand what happens in the assembly of the microbiome in early life. Without that, you can't really understand it. I think, so social isolation is very important. There's one other thing that you should do if you're a 15-week-old. Or is it 15 weeks?
15 weeks.
Oh my gosh, right. Yeah. Is get a pet.
Yeah, we got a pet.
Good. All right. Get them to give them a good lick. So get a pet.
So good.
Yeah, and then and then you've got to force them out into the garden. Okay. They need to play, right? Yeah. There's no such thing as wrong weather. There's just wrong clothes. They need to have their hands in their soil, and they need to be outside. Great. And you need to foster that relationship with nature, because it's the return to nature which is going to give them that connection with the microbiome. and all of the other health benefits that we know that they have.
Yeah, it's part of the reason why we actually moved, because we were living in central London and we thought to ourselves, you know what, let's move slightly outside of central London where there's a lot more greenery and a lot more times where we can spend some time in a local park. So
do you know what you should do? You will do this already because you're that guy, but like, you should, I think we should be doing this, teaching our kids how to grow vegetables and grow your own food. If you're lucky enough to have your own garden patch, they should be out there digging in the soil, growing their own vegetables, right? There's a million reasons why they should be doing that, but not least of all from a microbial perspective. Soil on the hands is good, right? I just can't advocate for that enough. We've got to teach our kids how to reconnect meaningfully in that way with soil and to have real ownership of it. And I appreciate that sounds like a bit of a middle-class fantasy. And it's easy to say that if you're privileged enough to have a garden. But I think there are really good examples of the social prescribing of these things to people who are coming out of hospital, who have meaningful healthcare problems. And we can deliver this as a therapy, as a society, if we begin to value it and measure it and understand its value.
Totally. I completely agree. And I think they do this very well in other countries in Europe, like, in France and places like that. If someone is reliant on formula for whatever reason, they can't breastfeed. Are there any additives or things that they can do within the diet of a child to improve their gut microbiome? Because I've looked at the back of these formula packs and they all look like Huel to me. They're just ultra processed. They've maybe got a bit of Fast and Goss in there added, but they all look the same and they look pretty ultra processed. So there is probably within parents this icky feeling that they're not doing the best for their child. Is there anything else that they can do extra beyond all the things that we just talked about?
So I need to be careful here because I'm not a pediatrician and I'm not necessarily an expert on infant nutrition. But with that caveat, what we know is from actually quite recent studies done in Scandinavia, I think it was in Finland actually, looking at the kind of the assembly of the microbiome in early life and trying to identify markers for healthy gut assembly that actually, unfortunately, formula feeding has a really big impact. And you see a very divergent microbiome from those kids that are breastfed. And what you see is microbes that are slightly more prone to inflammation within the gut, right? So it has, unfortunately, quite a big impact. So I think what it means is that when you're starting to feed your kid, that, as you go from formula feeding into solids, that you work quite quickly to give them a diversified diet that really isn't full of ultra processed food. Because the good news about the microbiome is that you can change it, right? It is modifiable, and actually when a kid is young, there's plenty of time to do it. The harder time to do it is when you're an adult, right? So the good news is, and the kind of hopeful thing I want to convey here is that actually being on an infant, formula feed is not a disaster. It's only a disaster if you then don't give your kid's gut what it needs as it assembles beyond that, all right? And the slight challenge here, of course, is that the children who are more likely to be on infant formulas are probably more likely to be in lower socioeconomic groups. You probably have parents that aren't equipped to do that. They don't have the education to do that. If you're listening to this podcast, the demographics probably suggest that you do, right? So you're going to be okay. Now advocating for particular probiotics, it's kind of hard to say. Actually, there are infant probiotics, and that might be one good example of where you might want to take one.
Interesting.
And prebiotic fibers are really good for that, and you can supplement many of these infant formulas are in fact now supplemented by them, which I think are quite good. We're seeing, particular kind of galacto-oligosaccharides that are coming out of breast milk, which are now being synthesized, and which you can now also give as a product to your infants. In fact, some adults take them for IBS treatment.
Really? Oh, interesting.
So
it's derived from human breast milk.
Wow. So these are sugars, prebiotic sugars identified in breast milk, which we know that specific species of bifidobacteria kind of bloom on. And so BIFs are like really they're vital keystone bacteria in the developing gut that have so many long-term important benefits for healthcare.
Brilliant. I've just had antibiotics. Now what? Not kid.
Okay.
Adult.
First thing, if you've had antibiotics, don't panic.
Okay.
Just don't panic. Everything's going to be cool. So it depends, number one, on the type of antibiotic you've had and also why you're taking it. So if you're sick and you're having an antibiotic, what you should be doing is thanking Alexander Fleming, that you're going to be fine. If you go back to the first, do you know what they first used, the case they first used antibiotics on when they kind of manufactured it and they were like putting it into trials? Do you know what it was? No. It was a policeman, I forget his name now, who had become septic from a rose thorn. He was a gardener and it was a rose thorn and he got an infected finger. And they gave him penicillin, and it didn't work, and he died of sepsis.
You talked about this in your book, didn't you?
I think I did.
Yes,
yeah. He died of
I
sepsis from a gardening injury, right? So we should be thankful for antibiotics. Antibiotics are the most precious and important medicines that we have. So we should use them sparingly, and when we use them, we should be deeply grateful for them. So if you're using them, don't panic, be grateful. If you're using a penicillin, the likelihood is that it will have a transitory and probably minor impact on the microbiome. It will probably be there for about 6 weeks and it will bounce back. The problem comes if you're using them repeatedly.
Okay.
So if you're having dose after dose after dose, then that becomes a problem because the resilience of the microbiome is lost after each dose. It goes away. If you're using what we call broad spectrum antibiotics, so different antibiotics have very different effects on the microbiome, then the consequences can be much greater. So if you're taking what we call a macrolide, like erythromycin, for example, the impact can be very, very broad and it can be very, very long-standing. And we're just beginning to understand the consequences of that and what it means and why some people are so susceptible to it and others are, in fact, very resistant to it. So the general advice is if you're going to take it on the indication of a doctor. Say to your doctor, can you please take some cultures to make sure that I'm on the most targeted antibiotic therapy that I can possibly be on so that you're not on those big broad spectrum antibiotics. The third thing you should be doing is really thinking about nutrition and diet. So what we know is that diet antibiotic interactions are really, really important in determining not just the effectiveness of that antibiotic, but how many antimicrobial resistance genes you're carrying in your gut and what it means for your gut diversity going forward. So that's exactly the moment where you take the bottles of Lucozade and you throw them in the bin. You take those sugary electrolyte drinks, you put them in the bin. The chocolates your granny brings, you put them in the bin, right? All the sweets and crap we have on our bedside when you're sick, that all has to go. If it's coming wrapped in plastic, chuck it away, right? What you want is, that's the key time. You want your plant-based foods. That is the time you should be taking a multi-strain, high-dose probiotic, and you should probably be thinking about really minimizing the amount of ultra-processed foods in your diet.
Brilliant. Okay.
It will give your gut more resilience, more sustainability. And then what you really want is to minimize the duration of the antibiotic dose that you're on, right? So that's a balance because, dogma states that you finish the course because you kill it and you prevent it coming back. But I think we're getting better at targeting that and minimizing it. And what you don't want to do is to necessarily take repeat and recurrent courses of these antibiotics. I think, the other thing that I would say is get vaccinated, right? It's such a controversial topic and it just shouldn't be. Like a flu vaccine, it's super safe, it's super cheap. If you take it, you're much less likely to need an antibiotic in the first place. So minimize the things that, minimize your risk, right? Have a diverse microbiome, give it all of the resilience it needs. Take a vaccine, and then if you need it, okay, you need it, but then there are things that you can do to protect it along the way.
You mentioned multi-strain, high dose. What is defined as a high dose? So,
what you'll find is that the dosing is very variable. It's described often in something called colony forming units, often described in billions. Yeah. Okay, so anything over 4 to 5 would be high dose. Some go up to 9, some are kind of low, down around 1.
And every GP has probably experienced somebody who comes in and says, you know what, I feel better after 3 days. Do I stop the antibiotics then, or do I have to finish the course of 5 or 7 days?
I think what I mean is finish the prescribed course.
Okay.
I suppose what I meant was taking second, third, and fourth line courses, right? If you're taking second, third, fourth line courses, you may be on the wrong antibiotic for the wrong reasons, and you need to really stop and pause and ask yourself why. And a lot of that is not very well evidenced by clinicians, right? So
okay, we're going to do a quick fire round at the end.
Go for it.
Bone broth. What are your thoughts?
Quite like bone broth. Recommend it for patients who have got gut inflammation. They're really quite unwell. So resting the gut, going onto a kind of really simple diet like that will, again, all your microbes will die out. You'll have less inflammation briefly. You'll feel a bit better. Your gut is not kind of processing things in the same way, and your bloating will get better. Things will get easier. So bone broth as a temporary solution to a problem, very good. As part of a diverse diet, very happy to take it, quite like it.
Great. And you're vegetarian now, so what do you use?
I'm trying to be vegetarian.
Oh, you try? Okay, fine. So
I have one rule with vegetarianism before my mates absolutely slay me when they listen to this, which is that if I go to someone's house and they prepare food for me, I eat what I'm given.
That's the same with me.
Yeah.
That's actually my rule. So I'm pescatarian,
yeah.
which you've probably got some opinions on from an ecological point of view. But when I go to someone's house and if they've prepared me, I'm not fussy.
No, I just eat it.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy it. So if anyone wants to invite me over, I'm available.
Raw milk.
Yeah, can we just stop this? Like, no, ever, no, just don't do it. Please, and whatever, just no.
What about raw milk cheese?
No, well, no. So, I get a lot of patients coming to me swearing by it, and it's just dangerous and silly, and we just got to stop this. Like pasteurizing milk doesn't meaningfully change, the benefits that you have from having dairy. And what we've seen is since between 2003 and 2013, there were no cases of kind of outbreaks of pathogens from eating raw milk, of consuming raw milk, Since about 2013, it's just skyrocketed. I forget how many there's been. There's been loads. Yeah. So we see these big outbreaks of E. coli, 0157. We see big outbreaks of Campylobacter infections. We've seen, and a third of all of these infections happen in kids, and we've seen a death from it, right? Like, we pasteurize milk for a reason. Yeah. Like, don't drink unpasteurized milk.
The potential benefits, if there are any, completely outweighed by the
I just think you're gambling,
risks,
right? Yeah. So I was reading a paper on this. They were looking at standardized safety of kind of various dairy products compared to the relative proportion of pathogens that they might find in that product. And they found that only about 60% of raw milks were what they were described as adequate. Okay, so that means 40% of them are not adequate, and 5% were just dangerous. Yeah. So you've got a 5% chance of coming to serious harm, and you've got about a 40% chance of coming to moderate harm. And that's just, if I said to you, look, we're all going on holiday, lads, and we're going to get on the EasyJet flight, and there's a 5% chance it's going to crash. We're not going on holiday, right? So let's just not go on. Let's just be sensible.
I love it. I love the pragmatism. James, I'm going to let you go to your MDT, but honestly, the book, like I said last time, Dark Matter, is phenomenal. I'm sure you've got more books in the pipeline at some point in the future.
I'm trying.
But I've got so many more questions as well that we've got and our community have got. So if you're up for it at some point in the future, I'd love to
whatever I can
talk
do to
you
help,
again.
Ricky,
It'll be brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And I'll send you some lunch options.
Please kitchen
do. Up in the meantime.
I'm all in.
If you want to learn about how to improve your gut health with simple tips, click this video right here. I've done a full video on how you can improve your gut health using food and lifestyle.